This is the 7th video in our series about building a website. In this video we want to look at the issue of how to make our site truly responsive. So far we've planned out what we require and we kept it stupidly simple. We've produced a first build making a clear separation between the HTML and the CSS. We've created a single template for our default page, but we have a layout problem. Our page doesn't work well on narrow screens, for example on mobile phones. To solve this problem properly, we need to use a viewport statement in our HTML, and we also need some @media statements in our CSS. So let's look first of all at the viewport statement. We need to add a bit of metadata in the head section of each web page that we put out. And it looks like this. We have a line that says meta, to say it's a meta statement. It has a name, viewport, and the content is width equals device width and initial scale equals 1.0, and it's formatted as it is on this slide here. This tells our high resolution, potentially mobile device, not to display the page in tiny mode. If we don't have it, things might look fine on our laptop or whatever, but view it on a mobile phone and the page might be perfectly rendered, but in very tiny mode. So our next job is to decide on breakpoints in how our page displays. I like to think of my display happening in 3 bands, if you like. So the first band would be anything from 330 pixels to 480 pixels wide, and that will suit mobile phones, particularly in portrait mode typically. Then from 481 to 600 pixels, that would suit mobiles in landscape mode or tablets in portrait mode, for example. And from 601 to 850 pixels, it'll be anything that's not quite full width, right up to the full width design. So it's our full width design and how narrow it can go until we need to say, no, this needs to change before it will be properly readable. However, this is just an example, and these values can change significantly depending on how our page is designed. I typically, on simple websites, go for a single column presentation. If you've got multiple columns, you're almost certainly going to need wider values in there and different breakpoints. Now, how do we lay out our CSS? Well, we're going to have several @media sections in there, but the very first section of our CSS file will define the default. So it comes before any @media statements, and that's because old legacy browsers don't understand the @media statement, so this is the only part they'll take notice of. So in effect, the first section is our legacy browser definition. We then introduce 3 sections, one for each of our design widths. Having introduced the 3 @media sections, we now need to populate them. So let's have a look at the first one, which we'll take as being the one that defines our narrow screen display. And let's think about the 3 main tweaks we want to make. We'll reduce the font size, because although it's small, if we don't reduce the font size, then it will tend to make for very few words on a line. So reduce the font size, then reduce the margins so that we make maximum use of the space available, and we'll tweak the header graphic and the heading text just to make it look right. Next, we'll look at the intermediate size. Now in this one, we don't need to reduce the font size so much, but we do need to reduce the margins to maximise the usage we can make of the space available to us. And we'll probably need to make an intermediate tweak to the header, so not reduce things quite as much, but reduce them a little bit so the header looks okay. For the final up to full size @media section, we might just get away with an empty section. It will all depend on whether we've managed to create a cross-browser compatible design in the first, before the @media section bit. And one little hint here is the sort of problems. It's usually Internet Explorer that causes the major headaches. Developers tend to tear their head out over Internet Explorer because it doesn't follow the conventions, and it doesn't even maintain consistency from version to version. But one problem is the early Internet Explorer box problem, because it defined how margin worked differently from the Internet standard. And so one way around that is to say, if you set all margins to 0 and set your spacings via padding, it will help significantly. That's a rather quick and dirty way of explaining it, but that's one example of the sort of principle you can apply to get your design more cross-browser compatible. And if you have got it right, then with a bit of luck you might get away with an empty section on this final app media bit, as we say here. Having put that all together, it's important, of course, to test your design. So don't forget that the developer tools in your browser are your friend. Do use them to check what you've done. You might find someone out there viewing your site in a browser that doesn't understand HTML semantic structures. They're using a legacy browser. The first question to ask is, do I care? That's a sensible question. It's not just whatever, because it will depend on how many people are out there who might be using legacy browsers. So there are still some folk out there still using XP and Internet Explorer 6. They are an increasingly very small group of people, and there comes a point at which the amount of effort that's required to make things work in their browser is sufficiently much that it's not worth the effort for the return on the effort you've put in. On the other hand, if it's easy to fix, why not just do it? So particularly with legacy browsers and making them understand the HTML5 semantic structures, it's an easy one-liner. All you need to do is to add this code at the beginning of your CSS. Okay, it's 2 lines on this slide because I've added in the comment. But basically we just take all the HTML5 semantic elements and define them as having a characteristic, an attribute of display block. They're block elements, and then everything works. Hey, that's really nice and easy, isn't it? That fixes it particularly for legacy browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, all of those. It also helps fix it for Internet Explorer 10 and 11, but Internet Explorer 9 and earlier, even that doesn't work for them. There is, however, a JavaScript fix which you can use, and which might still be worth doing because there might be enough legacy Internet Explorer browsers out there for you to care about it. To make this fix, it's actually a JavaScript fix, and it's done in the HTML head section, so we need to sort that out, not in the CSS but in the HTML. Well, because we've marshalled out our code nice and sensibly and thoughtfully, we only have to sort it out once in our template HTML, and we just edit our HTML, template.html, and put these few lines in, and that's fixed it. So that's it. We've fixed for just about any screen browser width. Legacy browsers should work okay. Even Internet Explorer should give a half-decent result. Remember, of course, that we may not be in coping with legacy browsers and Internet Explorer. We may not have a perfect rendering of the website as we intended, but so long as it's readable and usable and doesn't look too horrendous, then maybe we're happy with what we've got there. So that was easy, especially since we only had to deal with changes to template.html and surface.css, and it sorted out things for the entire website. Brilliant. So our separation of concerns and putting things into places so that we only change things once in one place is really working nicely for us. So is that really it? Well, we ought to have another little look at how we've done our menus, but we'll think about that next time.